Okay, hello to everyone. We are going to get settled into this as others join us. So a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us for this event that is part of London Climate Action Week. Our seminar today is titled Land Rights and Resilience in Kenya. Okay, and I'm very excited about this because it's sort of centering a very important relationship the African Leadership Center has with the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. We've had a partnership that includes a mobility element, which means members of staff from the ALC can visit IDS at the University of Nairobi, as well as students, and we can have reverse visits where members of staff from the IDS at the University of Nairobi and students also from there can visit us here at the ALC at King's College London. And so we have this event today where we're spotlighting the amazing research that some of the PGR students at IDS are carrying out that's linked to land rights, linked to issues of pastoralism as well, covering a range of disciplinary concerns also. And we have the distinct pleasure of bringing that to you as part of this week's events. So we're going to have 4 presentations from 4 of our students from IDS. And then we're going to also have contributions from 2 discussants. One is a research fellow at the African Leadership Center, and the other is a PhD student in the Department of Geography at King's College London. So you can see it's a truly collaborative endeavor we have to offer you here today. So without further ado, I'm going to jump straight in and invite our first speaker to sort of share her work with us for 15 minutes, and then I'll move to the next speaker. Then we'll have the discussant also step in to offer comments. And then we'll open for Q&A. Then we'll move to the next set of presentations, the next 2 presentations, and then we'll have comments from a discussant there as well. So our first presentation is coming from Rama Hassan. And she's going to be speaking to us on a paper titled Changing Land Laws and the Resilience of Samburu Pastoralist Women. Rama is a social economic researcher from Kenya and a PhD fellow from the University of Nairobi and the University of Copenhagen. Rama, over to you. Please share your insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eka, and welcome everyone to this presentation. The piece of work that I'm going to share with you is part of my PhD research. It's a series of objectives and questions that I've been working on. And on this piece, I'm looking at resilience, looking at the relational and contextual approach to resilience, which is a term that has different disciplinary interpretations. But I'm going to look at the gender dimensions, focusing on Samburu pastoralist women. And in this case, looking at the changing land laws, my PhD is broadly on the land law reforms, the community land law, and pastoralist access to land as part of the Rights and Resilience project. So in this session, I'll share with you just a background of why this is, I find important, and a bit of resilience thinking, and the dynamics of the community land law, and the 3 aspects, how Samburu women how the resilience of Samburu women is manifested from our research, and also looking at a unique aspect of the changing household labor among them, and some concluding reflections on this. So generally, this work that builds on the concepts of socio-ecological resilience. I know that there are numerous definitions that have been fronted, others equating the opposite of resilience to vulnerability, but building more on the socio-ecological resilience and recognizing the importance of livelihood strategies among Samburu pastoralist women in the context of changing land laws and tenure. So yes, there's climate change, but there are other aspects that are coming into play in their ability to, have their livelihood sorted or even thrive in the environments that they live in. So the aspects about social processes of land access are important in this paper, as well as alternative strategies that different groups of people, and pastoralist women particularly, adopt based on who they are. So looking at pastoralists not as a homogeneous group, but getting in and figuring out, so who are these women and what do they have within them, and how is the resilience manifesting. And one of the things that is interesting is that mobility still remains a key feature for pastoralism in these areas, regardless of the shocks and the external pressures. And if movement in this variable environment is very critical for pastoralist households, so that they're able to reach and you know, this is well known about the patch resources that they need to search across, but then there are also long known pastoralist ways how they arrange their access to land, the social arrangements and the customary plans, as studied and written by others like Okoth Ogendo in the past, and the flexible ways and the buffers for the community. So looking at pastoralist resilience in the context of their land tenure, but also in how the community and the society is organized is important. So in terms of the changing land law, specifically, I'm referring to the community land law, a law that has been passed in Kenya. At least that's one of the reform processes. And it's critical for pastoralists because it recognizes that these communities can register their land, and including women, so that they're able to manage their land within their customary practices. So if this law also gives women unprecedented rights, at least by the way it expressly states these provisions, and the recognition that land impacts the ways in which pastoralists have lived in these spaces and how they continuously access land, then the dynamic that this law brings into the already difficult situations brought about by climate change are important. Because on the one hand, individualizing community land will enable people to privatize and fence off their land, and so that means exclusion. But then on the other hand, if the law then allows and safeguards communal ownership, then there will be equal shared access. And so that means there are new dynamics of negotiation, and that differs from when land is privatized. In terms of the theory about resilience thinking, I think broadly, there have been debates about pastoralism, whether it can survive these harsh climatic changes that are going on. But then there is also a growing evidence about the strength of pastoralism, and evidence that pastoralists are even more resilient. So drawing attention to the women among the Samburu brings about this relationship aspect and their experiences, how social actors within a community among the pastoralists would also strengthen their resilience. And recognizing these actors also helps us to look deeply into the contextual aspects of the resilience and the relational ones that are normally ignored. So the dimension of resilience that concerns networks and people and their relations would also help us understand how individuals like women, who are not necessarily at the center of land management, are able to deal with shocks, whether internal or external. And given the changing landscape in this rangelands, as you can see, with the dry seasons and the patchy areas and where there is no grass, and relying on acacia pods, as we can see there. So combining the law, the dynamics of the law, and what the women have to do is at the center of my presentation. So if the law is providing for the different marginalized groups for them to secure land, there are new dynamics that we find that are coming into play in the implementation of the law. But pastoralist women are moving with the shift and able to find ways and strategies that show their resilience in the process. So one of the ways is substitution. So pastoralist women, we found, are soliciting support from elders who are custodians of norms, and they have expressed that they are subtly finding ways to get included. They are aware that they are not in the group ranch register, for instance, but they have to find ways of accessing this land for their own domestic use if they want to do farming, or for their animals when they have the smaller animals like the goats. They are also subtly nudging their sons to demand inclusion as another way of them to get included. so that there are multiple men in the households who are involved, increasing their chances of access in future where they're not able to access. So on substitution, the point is that they're actively drawing on their son's power as substitution to access land. The second finding is about negotiation, which is known and written about pastoralists, about how they draw on their close social ties in the community, and they're enabled to access land through this mutual exchange and reciprocity. So by negotiating and convincing elders and the decision makers to reconsider their decisions, especially even when they are talking about subdivision of this communally owned land. So women who ordinarily would not get a chance believe that they're able to draw on these close ties with their families and clans, familial ties, to access land. Then there's finance, about women who can use finance to participate and benefit in different production systems through the local women groups, by investing in education and engaging in income generating activities. And one of them is like chicken rearing. And I have to mention that there is growing appetite for chicken in these shopping centers, in the growing shopping centers in Samburu. So the other important aspect is about, with reduced mobility, there has been changes in the households among the Samburu. So there are two main aspects of labor, as in the earlier work by Sparling, about herding and domestic roles are the two main aspects of labor. And they have been defined and divided by gender, so the male and female, but also by age, what the older males can do and the older females, and the younger as well. And the role of the older male and females reduces with time. So there is a certain age group that has the highest responsibility of both herding and domestic roles, which are intertwined, they're interdependent among the pastoralist households. So this shift in different roles, of course, has been occasioned by reduced mobility. There is no much mobility happening, and the changing lifestyles, including education and sedentary lifestyles, where we argue elsewhere has been a push of government to sedentarize pastoralists. And some of the Samburu women are now even moving into livestock, a role that they ordinarily did not perform before. And the other aspect is that the role of elders is changing, with younger people coming in to be members of the committees to manage land. So this also generational tension that comes in between youth and elders is a finding that we find is going to create some changing household labor, but as well as how the Samburu community is organized. So the women's role in providing alternative forms of livelihood is important in this case. And in terms of resilience, their role becomes more important in less resilient situations in pastoralist households. So look, not just pointing that women are more resilient, but that their resilience is needed in such changing environments. So some of the thoughts that I have on this paper that I can use to conclude is that resilient strategies adopted by women also differ across different groups of women, even among Samburu women. So for instance, resilience through substitution could be for widowed women who are not in the group ranch register, so they can substitute the power of their young sons to be able to access land. Those who are unmarried, so single women and migrant women, can draw on negotiation, so drawing on their ties. And those who are educated or have some job and they earn wages, and so they're employed in, or they can make money by selling some of the animals that they keep, they can draw on finance to engage and participate, building on their resilience. And in terms of labor, those from poor households can seek alternative wage labor and take care of livestock from those who richer families or families that need this labor. And previously, what we know is that this was a role of men, but even women are increasingly participating in taking care of livestock for neighbors. So, but in terms of land governance questions and issues of access, so we draw attention to the need to look at communities and how internally they're able to deal with the challenges that are presented by the changing land laws, especially the tenure regimes in Kenya and how they affect pastoralists, with increased attention to the rangelands and the big infrastructural projects that are coming up in these areas with large-scale land acquisition. So we need to look also at the gendered nature of resilience, reflecting how different relationships fluctuate among the pastoralists, And in this way, we can reconceptualize resilience and recreate it based on the experiences of pastoralists in the context that they live in. So that's my contribution for this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Rama. Very fascinating talk you've given us there, and a lot of food for thought that we'll come back to. We'll of course hear first from Rahinato as discussant before we move to a Q&A. So let's move on to our next presenter. So we're going to hear from Molo Alphonse Agola, who will be speaking to us about a paper titled, Will Global Climate Information Service and NGO Intermediaries Help Pastoralists and Other Vulnerable Communities Adapt to Climate Change? Now, Molo is a PhD fellow at the University of Nairobi, at the Institute for Development Studies, and the University of Copenhagen. Molo, we're going to hand over to you. Please, let's hear from you also for 15 minutes, and then we'll come to our discussant, Rahinato, to take us through her thoughts. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Just
okay, we can hear you. Okay, good. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So just slight change. I was on video, but you'll get it in a minute. So my internet is a little bit shaky. So the outline of my present, so I'll start from my first slide. So my question is, will Global Climate Information Service and NGOs, intermediaries, help pastoralists and other vulnerable groups adapt to climate change? And this is my question is part of the wider question on how best can international and national institutions support pastoralist adaptation. Yeah, and my main research topic has been break down that question. I picked one of the sub-questions in my thesis, and that is on Global Climate Information Service and the role played by civil societies and NGOs in terms of playing the intermediary roles to help pastoralists and other vulnerable groups. So my presentation now, I'll take you through a bit of history in terms of climate information, and some of the debates that form Climate Information Service and the products. And then mainly now, what is the real challenge here, and narrow it down to Climate Information Service as a policy on the moves, and do a little bit of a quick preview on my findings and what does it mean towards the policy implication for this. So there's currently within the climate conferences, there's a lot of attention towards providing climate information service and products to those living within dryland and especially pastoralists. And just to give it a quick break, NGOs play this important role in terms of being the intermediaries between pastoralist groups and pastoralist groups, the government agencies, and the civil society. The pastoralist groups, government, and even among the NGOs. So it's like NGOs have this unique policy space between government, between international and the donor community, and between the local community as the pastoralists. So somehow it is assumed that they are the voice to pastoral, to these groups, the vulnerable groups. And in line of this, so there's been effort that NGOs have been promoting a climate information system to enable pastoralists adapt better to climate change. And the promoting climate information service is done with the view that it will help in addressing the present and future climate risk. And this is premised on because for some of the developing countries, there is climate information is unavailable, it is shallow, and it's inaccessible to some of these groups. So the unreliability around this climate information makes NGOs want to play this role as being either disseminators or helping for production of information. So there are different medias that are used in terms of delivering climate information and its production. So one of it is the internet, and there's also the radio, then the web, and occasionally we have a publication around it. So the question is, if you have all that mode that is up on my left screen and on my right screen, and you want to impact on the pastoralist down here, so how best do you package your information to reach the pastoralist on the ground? And this again has been within now the greater global community, as climate information service is also seen as a policy idea that it entails the production, it's about provision and localization of climate information and knowledge to aid decision making. So this is something that was born out of climate activism within the Conference on Climate Change in the 1970s, and it has gone throughout to the UN conference in the 90s, where there are different, the formation of the intergovernment panel on climate change, and the IPPC, the UNFCCC, and the Global Climate Observation. So they were born out of this climate activism. And furthermore, recently, that's around 2009, there was the Global Framework for Disseminating Now Climate Information, and that is the Climate Information Service. So this is to facilitate climate information services. So when this was born out, then now the question has been that at the time when there was the discussion about by climate activists to disseminate climate information, so the question has been, how best then can climate information be used by those communities that are directly dependent on the weather? And does it really make that change as it was contextualized? So there have been different debates on climate information service, especially among pastoralists. So those who are pro this idea of climate information service and products, there's been the idea that it's a solution to the users who are deemed vulnerable, apart from also helping them make informed choices on adaptation decision. It's also seen as an opportunity to manage climate-related risk, and it's part of now bringing science and in terms of helping these communities that directly depend on climate. But again, these are good debates, but then there are those who've been against it. And part of the argument has been that pastoralist adaptation needs are really complex. You cannot summarize them using just that lens of climate information service alone. And then, this debate is pegged on the argument that pastoralists use their own indigenous, they rely on it, and they use their own indigenous way of climate knowledge. And again, there's the whole idea that pastoralism is designed to deal with uncertainty. I think the question is, uncertainty then was in terms of a predictable weather pattern. Currently, we are dealing with climate change, where you expect that it should be raining on a particular month, and it's not raining. You expect a particular scenario, like for Kenyan case, with long rains, March, somewhere around March, all the way to May, then short rains in October. But that is no longer happening as it used to be. So then now the question is, in that kind of uncertainty, do we still say pastoralism is designed to deal with now climate change, or it was then designed when the weather was a little bit predictable? And to just look at my study gap, theoretics and other studies argue that climate information service is really essential to support adaptation decisions for the vulnerable, some for pastoralists. But then there's less attention that for me I'm seeing in terms of looking at climate information system with that lens of policy on the move, or policy that is being translated from the global framework to the local pastoralist practices. And then again, what is the impact of when this policy, globally it's conceived that it is going to help the vulnerable community. But what is the impact of that kind of a policy on the ground? Does it really help this vulnerable community? And what is the perception of these communities down there? And when you're thinking of a policy on the move, then there's the need for insights into this policy and its usefulness by intermediaries like the NGOs, the producers, and end of the users. Because you promote it as a policy, but now when you subject it to that kind of academic rigor, to what extent beyond climate activism, does it really aid, or is it does it leave its usefulness? You know, information is used when it is salient, when you can really identify with it and you can trust even the source. So could we be producing climate products that to pastoralists, they don't need them or they don't deem that information legitimate? Then there's also little emphasis on the variation of perspectives on climate information. So the little emphasis of perspective at the global level. How is climate discussion, climate information system discussed nationally and locally in relation to pastoralism? And there are few studies that actually link climate information service and pastoralism. Mostly studies focus on getting this information and using it among farmers. Yeah, and finally, what is the impact on climate information in terms of pastoralist adaptation? So quickly, we can go through some of the findings. And pastoralists actually acknowledge
Molo, are you there? We've lost your volume, I think. Okay, I can't hear Molo. I don't know if I'm the only one.
Yeah, we've lost him.
Okay, I think we've lost Molo. I imagine he will join us back again at some point. If we can manage it, we will, we'll let him jump back in and carry on. In the meantime, I think as we have our discussant with us, perhaps it's the moment to invite her to share some thoughts. Let me introduce her briefly. Rahina Siddiqui-Alare is a PhD student at the Department of Geography at King's College London, and she's going to be offering comments on the papers that have been delivered by Rama and by Molo. So Rahina, let's move to you and hear from you. If we get Molo back, we'll have him come and finish his presentation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Rama, thank you for your presentation, and that was very interesting, given the fact that climate change impacts are being felt by everyone, and also more particularly women. And the fact that we are also, the literature on gender is also saying that women are not homogeneous groups, and the issues of social differences are very important for us to highlight women who are adapted to climate change, and also women who are equally more vulnerable to climate change. So the issue of intersectionality is very important here when it comes to climate change and gender studies. Yeah, it was also very interesting for you to highlight the importance of land reforms, how land reforms also influences women adaptation or pastoral women adaptation needs. Yeah, and given the fact that we live in a patriarchal society where women access to land has become a challenge. So I think it's also very timely for us to look at this. And the recent reports on IPCC also tells how climate change is going to have impacts on dry lands and arid areas. So I think your work is very timely and very important to start off with the discussion. Yeah, I looked at your work, and some of the things that I came across was that generally the issues of marriage, which is whether, yes, marriage was one thing, and whether you were widowed or not, and also the issue of education, access to income were very important for things for adaptation, which is very important to highlight when it comes to the issues of adaptation among women. However, I was wondering that given the impacts using women, one of the things that you mentioned was that women as a form of resilience was issues of using kinks, social ties. And one of the things that came to mind was that the issue of people are now more going into this issue of nuclearization where they are more tied to themselves. So I was wondering how sustainable using social ties as a form of resilience will be to for women. And then another question that came to mind was, where people kept on depending on others for information. And my question was, how do we make information more accessible to everyone, that we do not have to depend on our ties or networks to get this information? Maybe if you can respond to these two, I'll bring out the other questions out here.
Okay, thank you very much, Rahina, for that. Rama, I see Molo is back with us. So if I can interject and say, Rahina, thank you very much for that. Rama, I imagine you have those questions down. Hang on to those. Let's see if we can invite Molo back to, Molo, are you all right to carry on the presentation and to finish it and we come back to Rahina? Is that all right for you?
Yes, I'm all right. Please.
It's fine, don't worry, take a moment. Don't worry, carry on.
Yeah, sorry, my net just went kaput.
No problem, no problem. Don't take your moment. Take a moment and get that presentation back up. Don't worry.
Okay. So I'd reached the point when I was doing the findings and discussion. So one of the things that from my study is pastoralists really acknowledge receiving the climate information products and information via radio, via mobile phone, and the participatory scenario planning. And this is where, like now, for the participatory scenario planning, we have the Met department coming, the Kenya Met coming with their own prediction on weather, and this is they're working with the team from Intergovernmental Authority, and there's they have the ISPAC, the Intercontinental Agency on Climate, and they're also tapping into some of the expertise from UK Met. So it's kind of a very big working framework where there's different climate modeling and scenarios that is shared now through these participatory meetings locally. But it's NGOs who are at the center of organizing such meetings. So in these meetings, for pastoralists, they say they've participated in such meetings, they hear about climate information, and they also give their part of what they think is their prediction in these meetings. And now that having said that, the other thing that stood out during this kind of during my fieldwork was for pastoralists, they will say this climate information service product agents and intermediaries like NGOs are misguiding, which really leads to the question. So they said it in Kiswahili, these people, if I can say it they lead us to a different network. Yeah, they misguide us in terms of prediction. So then you ask if climate information service is really to help pastoralists make better decisions, then the pastoralist perspective is that it's misguiding. So are we making them make better decisions, or are we misguiding them? And then the other problem that was discussed, through FDGs they were discussing, is lack of feedback mechanism. If I give you a product, if I disseminate information to you, and then I go away, because NGOs are about times they are funded through particular programs and projects. And then after the dissemination exercise, the NGO, the agent is not around or the officer is not around. So they are saying that we cannot even confirm with them and tell them that that particular scenario didn't happen as predicted or it was false. So then lack of that feedback channel leads the question on how reliable is the information if we cannot provide, if we cannot have that kind of an exchange. And there's the other group, part of the FDG, there are some few pastoralists were mentioning that even among themselves, they had those who predicted, and this especially, you know, it varies among the age set. So this was the group that were initiated around they were initiated in the 80s and 90s. So they were talking of those who are doing the prediction. They are no more. They are all gone. So even amongst us, we do not really think of our prediction as accurate. But then that is for the group born in 70s and initiated like 20 years later. But there is this group that was born before 1970, and that's a different age set. So they say, for us, we still rely on the traditional one. Then now there's this there's another group that is, they're more educated, the group born in the 80s, and they're called Lishamis. So this group say, for us, we use the climate information, and it's especially important for those who have insured their livestock. So it's aiding make insurance decisions. So that's the livestock-based insurance. So there's that connection for that particular group. They look at CIS as the Climate Information Service as aiding the livestock-based insurance. And then there's a question on terms of prediction, the predictions not being accurate due to climate change. So there's that recognition that even using either the old system or the current system, you might not be accurate because climate change is happening and it's real. So for this particular, if you look at these different scenarios, then it leads to a wider question on now, what next then in terms of the conclusion and the policy implication. So one of it is for climate information service as a policy, the discussion both globally and nationally, it takes this, it's seen as it's very scientific and for scientific in terms of modeling, in terms of data that is utilized, and also like a way of getting the most accurate data. So that is the discussion globally and nationally about the scientific, this being a scientific and a technical way of helping pastoralists make decisions. Then the other national perspective, there's also a focus on legislation. With the Kenya Climate Change Act of 2016, there's the recognition of the space for climate information system, but it is there's a hybrid between that and the local system. And the need for capacity building, and where there's the talk about whenever they use data from UK Met, it's more accurate scenarios being predicted. So there are also those who see it as a funding opportunity, where that is for NGOs and some of the government agencies. So tapping into climate resilience funds and all these other global funds that are targeting developing countries. So if you look at it at the greater now discourse analysis, then there's the whole idea about technical and managerial outlook for touch to climate information. There's also the issue about the project culture, that this thing, NGOs are just looking for the money, the government is looking for money, so they're trying to just stay relevant, and they are not doing really so much. And then there's the other big issue that I'm finding out of the discussion is the issue of lack of trust. And the trust is really transactional. So how do I use your information if I don't trust you? And again, trust feeds into this disconnect between producers and producers of climate information and the target, which is now the pastoralists. And this leads to two competing frames. There's a group that believes in the traditional, there's this other group that looks towards the very modern way or the climate information. And finally, in terms of policy, there's increasing attention for Kenya in terms of integration of indigenous focus and the modern, or the climate information and the modern prediction. So thank you very much for your patience. And that marks the end of my presentation. And sorry for the hiccup.
Thank you so much, Molo. Don't worry. No, that's life, right? Don't worry at all. Really fascinating. Thank you for coming back and completing that. It gave us a lovely full picture there. Lots of fascinating points you've put on the table, I think, for all of us to deliberate. Thank you for that. Rahina, we'll come to you now. You had given a couple of points. I mean, you gave a lovely set of comments there. And some very pertinent points you made for Rama to respond to. Are you happy for us to go to Rama to respond to those and then come back to you to give thoughts on Molo or any additional thoughts on Rama? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Rama, over to you, please.
Thank you, Rahina, too, for your reflections on this paper. And of course, I would appreciate even some other comments which you have on the side that you can share with me. The 2 points that you raise, one is on social ties. It's very interesting how you put this point across about the sustainability of these social ties. And I agree with you that we need to account for the changes that have happened in pastoral communities in East Africa and the landscape, both in terms of what we are talking about, the land reforms, but also just generally the changes that have occurred in Kenya's governance system, the devolved governments. There's some of the centers in these areas have become very vibrant, and people moving into the centers for different, including diversification, as some other researchers in East Africa have looked at this issue. But there's also another growing set of evidence around the persistent nature of pastoralists' social ties and how they keep reinventing themselves. They change, but they persist. And I am persuaded to think in this case that this is why this still comes up as a resilience strategy for women. The nature of the communities, among pastoral communities, how they rely on their memories, their clan-based systems, even as land is increasingly being fragmented and subdivided, it's still being shared. I think we have made this point elsewhere in our work in Kajiado about sharing subdivided lands, that even when land has been subdivided, there are still new ways of negotiating access. So I take this point as some ideas I think I can also include in the paper about maybe we can also make some points about how these changes may affect the future of these social ties. And then your point about access to information and how that it's not sustainable as well for women to rely on their kin to get this information. And you are right about the barriers that women face in accessing information among the pastoralists, and the governance system and how it does not account for the vast lands that we are speaking about, bringing sedentarist policies in the rangelands and implementing them word for word, which is not working, a point we make in one of the papers we have written in this project, as well as the difficulty of the government officers to reach these people and share this information. So I would take this point as one of also some of the points for consideration in terms of how does access to information or the lack of it then affect these groups that cannot be reached, and who is doing anything about it in these changing land law reform processes. So thank you for those points, which I will pursue further in developing the paper.
Yeah. Will come in? Well, can go ahead. Okay.
Please go ahead, Rahina. Go ahead.
So Rama, my last question to you is the issue of resilience, and I know you have already defined what resilience here is, but there's a need. We're talking about the way resilience has been conceptualized, and the fact that we need to move to transformative adaptation as well, and given that the uncertainties surrounding climate change impacts. So I was just wondering, at what for now, this is what they are doing, but is there a way we can transform from this, move to a more resilient one? When I say more resilient one, as a resilience as a transformation, because given the range of strategies that they use to adapt to climate change, given that if the impacts of climate change becomes worse, will these strategies, do you think that it will be effective in building their adaptive capacity?
Yeah, maybe I can take that as one way. I think it's something that I need to do to redefine this. I think I shared that the disciplinary interpretations are also becoming controversial in terms of how we understand resilience, but there are more and more people moving into what we would call the contextual relational resilience as identity. And these are some of the concepts that more people, especially anthropologists, think that could define pastoral resilience. But I think the more important one which you raise is about how we can recreate and reconceptualize resilience based on the experiences of the pastoralists and the context they live in. And in this way, then we don't need to define it, but reconceptualize it as we see it, as the lives of people unfold. But it looks like a day-to-day decision making for most of the communities, given the climate change, the harsh realities that they're facing in the rangelands. But I take the point about not just what they're doing to cope, but how can they thrive in the environments that they live in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be moving to Alfonso right now. Yes. Thank you for your presentation, and I've just taken some notes about, yes, you've given us a history of how CIS was emanated, and then also how it has been used by the pastoralists. You've also gone ahead to look at the contestation surrounding CIS and adaptation issues, and also how there's this agenda to push CIS for adaptation at the national level, which has trickled down to the local level. Yes, I was just also looking at the issue of, you talked about the policy aspect of it, but I was looking at this concept of knowledge brokering and how that ties in your work. I don't know whether you've gone to that extent of looking at it, but looking at, you can make a comment on that as well. And you've talked about how pastoralists have the issue of trust, because they do not and they do not believe what is being said, or doesn't really translate to realities on the ground. So I was wondering, you've looked at it, but I don't know whether you've looked at women needs of CIS, or you've looked at it in terms of gendered nature of how pastoralists need, the kind of information they need to be able to adapt, or you've just generalized it as pastoralists, because I literally saying that people have different needs for climate information needs. So if you can make a comment on that one. And also, you also talked about, and this is something that is also happening all over, even in West Africa as well, because we have projects, NGOs come onto the ground, they have projects on climate information system, and once they leave, that it ends there. Yeah, so how can we promote sustainability of some of these CIS projects that are there? And then you talked about the UK, people trusting the UK for Met forecasting than that of Kenyans. So what are the issues there with the climate information services of Kenya that is making it on people not to trust the services? Maybe if you can make comments on this, and then I can come back again.
Thank you so much, Rahina. Excellent comments there. Molo, please comment. I just want to encourage colleagues, please put your questions in the Q&A section. We can start taking them. So when we finish this element, we take your questions too. Thank you. Molo, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the wonderful comments. And so I'll start with the issue on the need to look at the gender lens, which I need to pay attention to. When I started the study, first of all, I started by kind of teasing that salient element of the organization of the pastoralist institution around age set. And I looked at it from that perspective that different age sets may have different needs, or may look at climate information products differently. And there's the discussion for different groups. There are those who are pro climate information and those who are not really for it. But that part of gender will really enrich the paper. So I'll pay attention to the question on are these needs different even among, when you look at the age set and you also bring in a new lens for the gender, does it really vary? So thank you. And then the next question on the project culture. How do you ensure sustainability? And really, it's a good question to ponder on, because it's is that question of even when you look at the debates around INGOs, NGOs, as intermediaries in CIS, whose interest do they serve? Is it about where the money is put, or is it about this is what is needed? Yeah. And the advantage is like when it comes to some of these works in Kenya, there's now more or less like inter kind of agency kind of working, where you have government working with NGO, working with this department. So there's that multi kind of institutional approach or multidimensional approach to this kind of work. So we find like the Kenya Met Department works with the National Drought Management Authority and now an NGO in terms of disseminating this information. So with the government agency in place, then we might think of it towards the sustainability, but that also needs to be interrogated. Does just having the government there makes this this kind of an approach to adaptation needs, does it translate really to sustainability in the end goal? Or is it about when somebody shows up at the door of the government, then they'll say, let's board this bus and let's do what this person wants. And finally, on the issue of the knowledge brokerage, policy translation, yes, that is one of the areas that I'm looking at, the two knowledge frames. So in terms of the discussion, I'm centering it around the knowledge brokerage. Is it about whoever pays, then his knowledge is looked at, is amplified to the next level, or whoever doesn't have the money, then the knowledge disappears? And the role of NGOs intermediaries, do they just come as brokers of knowledge, or is there any other role in terms of policy translation? So that I should pay attention to. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the wonderful comment.
Okay, and lastly, yes, so just to make a comment, in terms of the information needs of the pastoralists, do they want it in terms of production of cow or milking or whatever? So if you can highlight maybe the where exactly do they need a kind of climate information services for the system that they operate, it will be very helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so can I make a comment, a brief one? So the information needs, I'm tying it to one of the papers I'm working on hay production, where there's that is also happening among pastoral areas. And increasingly, they are also purchasing hay on their own initiative. So my argument is that climate information product need to integrate issues of when do you purchase fodder or when do you grow your own fodder. And can you, how much fodder do you need for this number of cows to sustain you in a particular scenario? So that kind of information to develop a model around that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eka.
Thank you very much for that. Wonderful exchange there between Rama, Rahina, and Molo. Thank you very much. Very rich material that we've heard. I don't want to abuse my chair's privilege just yet. I do see a question here that I'm going to see. I'm going to try and locate here. Right, from David. Dr. David Mambari asked, oh, sorry, guys, trying to get that. It's a long one. David, do you want to come on? And oh, I see a hand. David, do you want to come on and ask? Can I allow you to speak? If I can find you.
Hello?
Yes, David, I can hear you, please.
Yes. No, thank you very much for both presentations. I was just putting a comment there that from listening to these presentations, both of them, as somebody who is in the African Leadership Center, I can draw some interesting connections with leadership frameworks or studies that we engage in, or debates we engage in at the African Leadership Center. For the first presentation, I note that there is a discussion on how this group of women as actors navigate issues of power in this patriarchal context. So that was an interesting connection. The second one was mention of mutuality and that negotiation or search of mutuality between different actors. And the third one was for the second presentation, issues to do with trust that were being discussed. So I just wanted to note that for in the African Leadership Center, with the debates that we usually have, I find it fascinating that you are working on projects that, yeah, we can be in conversation with, even from that perspective. Having said that, I have then a couple of questions very quickly when they are all connected. How do you know what you know? And that's what I'd written. And how did you arrive or construct this knowledge that you are sharing with us? Can you please tell us about the process of constructing the knowledge and collecting this evidence? Thank you, and really fascinating work. I look forward to reading the final product.
Thank you very much for that, David. I really concur on the sort of synergies there with the leadership work that goes on at the center. So to both of you, if you take that question from David, how you construct knowledge, how do you arrive at where you are calling this knowledge, and what processes have underpinned that? Maybe, so hold on to that. I see Rose Bella's hand is up. I'm going to invite her to make her comment. And I saw another, and I will take the two questions in the Q&A now, and then have I'll give the floor to both of you to please come back. Thanks. Rosbella, your hand is down. Is that, let's look for you. Are you fine? Did you want to say something, Rosbella? Okay, I'm not hearing anything from Rosbella, so let me look at the questions that have come to us from Alexandra. Alexandra is asking Molo, how relevant is the availability of CIS in terms of its cost? And does good quality data have to be paid for? Is it freely available? How does this impact or shape climate resilience? Thanks for that. And then Alexandra is also asking a very useful question. How do you suggest the feedback mechanism concerning reliability and data accuracy ought to be improved? What would that look like? How would it work? From Martin Brown Munene, we're hearing it's a question to Molo as well. And is asking, do I suppose you are suggesting transforming or translating the CIS into some sort of advisory I guess, advisory product that's tailored specifically to the pastoralists, okay? So those questions to you. Sorry, I'm seeing an attendee. Okay, let me allow Alfred to speak and then we come to everyone. Alfred, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I had actually put my questions on the chat, but I can summarize them in a very quick way. Thank you for the presentations. I was particularly struck by the two issues, which I would like to follow up with any of the presenters. One is of state capacity and whether they did consider the capacity or incapacities of the state, because previous research that I've done there, the state is still well recognized. However, in terms of whether it meets the expectations of the society is another question due to many other factors of capacity, resource, and ability to, to respond to the needs of those societies. And related to this is whether on the issue of trust, is whether they have looked at the push and the pull factors of trust, because if there is somebody or there are entities who are providing this information and they are being distrust, is it a question of whether they are able to meet the expectations of the society, and are they aligned? So if the society, for instance, need information so that they can determine where the pastures are, the person who is providing this information, are they providing information that is relevant to their needs, or are they, as you said, Alphonse said, are they misleading, and how are they misleading? Is this what is contributing to issues of trust? If they could elaborate on those two issues, but they can also reference, I've put the questions in case they are not clear in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Alfred. I think they are. Thanks for that. Great questions there on the state and on the push-pull factors in relation to trust. Shall we go first to Rama on that, and then we come to Molo? So you can pick the questions that fit with what you've shared or presented, and then we go to Molo. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I can respond to some of the questions, one by David asking us how we know what we know, how we came up with this research. My research is purely qualitative, and in the beginning, like in 2019, we asked pastoralists, communities, some questions that we had come up with to answer, to know how the implementation of the Community Land Act is going. But for this piece of work, we deliberately chose to speak to women after a series of interviews, and we realized we were not reaching them directly, and we wanted to hear the voices of pastoral women and their experiences in the changing land laws and how they were coping or thriving in the given circumstances. So purely qualitative and targeting women specifically for this case, for obvious reasons that we needed to know the gendered aspects of resilience. And we had different things. And what I presented was what we kept hearing from the women. So sort of the usual process of a qualitative study. So I also wanted to mention briefly about what Alfred has talked about, the capacity of the state. And in other pieces, which will be coming out soon, we ask the question about the relationships between the national and the county government, both the capacity, but also the intention of the state. Because pastoralists need, they have been marginalized for so long. The story of Northern Kenya, for instance, is known in Kenya about how they've been marginalized, left out. But then the policies are still being brought with no changes in how access to these communities can be improved. So we see the implementation happening in contractions, and we ask whether the state is indeed ready to move these communities to a different level, or even to implement these policies. So both the incapacity or finances or even human resource, but also the intention. So we question this and pastoralist communities, we want to present their voices on how they feel. Some of them feel that that law, community land law, does not belong to them. It belongs to the people of Nairobi. So you can see the push of and the feelings of the communities and how they feel about this marginalization. So maybe some of them are also for reflection for me, but I could just say that for now.
Thank you very much for that, Rama. Yes, a lot of material there to take with you. Molo, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alfred, and for the observations that you made. How do we know what we know? So mine has been also purely qualitative, with the focus group discussions with different age groups. At times I bring them those that we've done jointly with the different age sets, and also I've also relied on key informant with especially the opinion leaders among the pastoral communities. Then partly I've also worked, my work is being built through argumentative discourse analysis. So there's that bit of what is not said, what is said, and what is the implication of these stories that are coming from the pastoralists. Then the whole question about trust, and it brings me the question that about the state capacity and trust. So if I can ask, if I look at it from the other side, what has been the relationship between the state and the pastoralists? And it has not been one of the best marriages. I can say it has been abusive. And for the pastoralists, whenever it's an external agent now, like even an NGO or INGO, then they are a little bit, there's that bit of a little bit reluctant. Let's wait and see. Let's hope that this is the right thing that is being done, and it's about responding to our own needs. So there's been that kind of a pull or something that drives them away from this kind of external agencies. But the information I've obtained is really good for the development of this particular paper I'm working on. So thank you. And most of it is actually reflection. Once you've done this paper, can you sit back and look at it from what really drives trust or not trust? Or why will somebody blatantly say that they're throwing us off our usual network? And what is this usual network? So really, there are good questions that I've taken note of them, and I'm reflecting on them. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you, to Rahina, to Rama, and to Molo. Really insightful work there. To Rama, my own one comment really is I was very interested in your conversation about how this helps in reconceptualizing resilience. And, I'd really encourage you to see how this work is not provincialized, right? That reconceptualization exercise, what value does it offer to the idea, the notion, the concept of resilience that we know is getting more and more knotty? And we don't stop it just with the case study you're dealing with. So that's fantastic. And to Molo, I was really struck by what you shared in terms of the relevance of CIS. And it brought to my mind the work of Helen Varren, where she asked, what is science, right? What is science? And the importance of empiricism also in, how we develop science. And a lot of our critical African scholars have often said that when you have certain frameworks built without centering empirical contexts in the spaces we're in, then we have to ask some of these more complicated questions. But thank you so very much. Let me now move swiftly to our next set of presenters to please take the stage, as it were. So we will hear first of all from Jackson Wachira, who will speak to us about a paper titled NGO-led community-based conservation and pastoralist climate change adaptation in Kenya. Jackson is a doctoral candidate at the Institute of Climate Change and Adaptation at the University of Nairobi. Jackson, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Eka. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can. I imagine others can. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, and you can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see your presentation, Jackson. We can, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks so much for the introduction, Eka, and I'm really happy to share with this team some preliminary findings from my work in Samburu, and I'm glad that my colleagues have already set the ground, I think, in terms of theory and in terms of the context. But my study is specifically interested in the large-scale control of land and how that interacts with the pastoralist climate change adaptation. And in this paper, particularly interested in the notion of community-based conservation. And I'll start with some background, just to set the stage and also introduce my research problem. And I'll start by saying that, like other so-called ecosystem-based adaptation, community-based conservation has been touted as a transformative climate change adaptation pathway. And I think discussions of that have already come up in the previous papers about what is transformative climate change adaptation. And in Kenya, CBC or community-based conservation as EBA is especially evident in the arid and semi-arid regions inhabited by pastoralists. And as our data shows and as extensive literature shows, semi-arid and arid regions of the world are some of the worst hit regions of the world by the adverse impacts of climate change. In Kenya, in fact, we do regard them as climate change hotspots. And in Kenya, the notion of community-based conservation as EBA is especially spearheaded by the Northern Regional Trust, which is an organization that has come up in the last 2 decades, establishing and working with about 39 community-based conservancies, undertaking multiple multi-year climate change adaptation-oriented interventions. As you can see on the graph on my right, which I developed based on data from some NRT documents, the notion of the idea of community-based conservation or conservancies has really grown, in a meteoric trend, starting the start of the millennium, and it has indeed especially grown in the last few years, where most of the conservancies were established. I think it should be about 60% of them. And this growth of community-based conservation is also embedded in a national policy context that moves from experimentation to a philosophy of decentralization of power and resources as envisioned in Kenya's Constitution of 2010. And this policy context is also anchored on an international, framework that does encourage climate change adaptation, but also nature-based solution and ecosystem-based solutions as one of the pathways to climate change adaptation. But despite this, growth that we have witnessed in the recent past, there really exists quite minimal scientific studies on how this concept interacts with pastoralist climate change adaptation. I will take you quickly through the concepts and theory that informs this study. And the first one is community-based conservation, which draws from the principles of collective action and common pool resource governance, work that has emerged since the 1990s and has challenged the notions of tragedy of commons. And I think my colleagues have already spoken into that. The tragedy of commons having come up in the 1968 around, pastoralists not be able to manage their ridgelands because, after all, everyone suffers if we all use the way we want. But community-based conservation or the notion of common pool resources has challenged that, indicating the existence of rules and regulations that indigenous communities have used over years to manage their ecosystem. And then the more relatively newer notion of ecosystem-based adaptation, which emerged really in the 2000s, brings the idea of using biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of an overall adaptation strategy to help people adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. And EBA does indeed borrow heavily from the notion of community pool resource governance. But some scholars have criticized this as a way of large-scale control of land, and some of them have termed it as a form of green grabbing, and you can see the literature there. Then the issue of climate change adaptation has been discussed in previous presentations, and the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change has defined this as an adjustment in natural human systems in response to actual expected climate stimuli, or the effect which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. A definition that critical researchers argue really highlights the political nature of climate change adaptation. it appears a simplistic definition, but in there lies a lot of complex political processes that go into climate change adaptation. And therefore, some researchers, define it as a political process, which results in contested and differentiated outcomes at multiple levels. At the multiple levels, I mean at the local levels, at the national levels, at the international level, climate change adaptation is really contested and results in differentiated outputs. And then, of course, within political analysis, there's the issue of power, and power is understood as multifaceted and fluid, and therefore it's difficult to predict the winners and the losers, calling for a sound investigation. So my work is based on field work collected in Samburu over the last 2 years, and it has a mixed methods approach. So far, I've been able to talk with about 30 key informants. Conducted about 11 focus group discussions, and importantly, I've talked with household heads and spouses from 352 households in Samburu West and Samburu Central. And in terms of analysis, I've gone into thematic analysis and content analysis of documents, descriptive and influential analysis. If we have to talk about adaptation, then we have to talk about climate change. And I did a quick survey to understand the state of climate in Samburu, at least from local perceptions, because they really matter. And as you can see here, one of the respondents remarked that these days in Samburu, it rains on one side of a tree and not the other, which is strange. And in this case, the respondents is just trying to talk about the sporadic and unreliable and unpredictable nature of rainfall as an element of climate in this area. But also importantly, out of this household, a majority of the people, a significant majority of the people really think that the climate has changed for the worse. And the impacts are really multiple and diverse, because different people are affected differently by adverse impacts of climate change. But as you can see here, the most or the main impacts relate around reduced pasture for livestock, increased livestock deaths, and reduced food for human consumption. I've also engaged with the concept of community-based conservation based on historical narrations and review of documents. And it tells a story of multiple actors with different and competing interests, and power is central. As you can see on the images on my left, we can trace this concept from the 1990s, and it has gone through like 4 epochs. So with the 1990s starting as a development project funded by the World Bank, in the 1990s being supported by local initiative and private actors and substantial political buy-in. In the 2000s, emergence of a powerful NGO involved in the conservation. And since the 2010s, the onset of devolution of power and resources from the Constitution 2010, and the enactment of a range of legislations and policies around climate change adaptation and community-based conservation, including the Climate Change Act of 2016 and the Wildlife and Conservation Acts of 2013. And it's during this time that we have really witnessed a huge growth of this notion. And of course, on the right, you can see there's a whole lot of actors involved in this model of conservation and therefore ecosystem-based adaptation. And this includes the Northern Regional Trust, multiple donors, the government of Kenya at the national level, at the county level. I also analyze and find that, pastoralists are no longer just, like one group that believe and trust in migration over long distances to survive. But there's also a transitioning group of pastoralists that have different ideologies and approaches to pastoralism. And in all these actors, there is a complete range of interests and aspirations that have resulted into much contestation in the recent past. So there's the issue of tourism, there's the issue of conservation, there is much interest around sedentalization of pastoralists by the government, NGO, and county level actors. But for the traditional pastoralists, the issue of extensive land for grazing and allowing migration is still core, as Rama mentioned. But for the transitioning and transition pastoralists, the issue of privatization of land and for grazing and speculation emerges as a real interest that competes and challenges the traditional notion of pastoralism. So it draws us back to that issue of climate change adaptation as a political process involving contestation and differentiated outcomes. So I have undertaken an analysis of implications of community-based conservation on pastoralist climate change adaptation based on work done by Herrero and colleagues in 2016, where they have undertaken a global study on typical pastoralist climate change adaptation. And we have related that with the climate change adaptation strategies in Samburu, and undertaken statistical analysis around the implication of CBC on pastoralist climate change adaptation, and we have some interesting emerging results. So out of the 21 statements that we have posed to pastoralists that we work with, pastoralists are neutral about 10 of those statements. Out of those 27, pastoralists disagree with 7 of them that link CBC to pastoralist climate change adaptation, and they agree with 3 of those statements, and we have more details around which particular statements these ones are. So, and what's the conclusion out of this analysis and data? So we find that over time, NGO-led CBC has evolved from conservation imperatives to integrate ecosystem-based adaptation as a way of reducing adverse impacts of climate change on pastoralist communities. However, data suggests at this point that pastoralists are mainly ambivalent. They are a bit indifferent about the role of NGO-led CBC concerning their climate change adaptation. And the source of this indifference is a subject of further data collection and analysis on my part. However, it suggests that this may be attributed to the multiple interests and power plays that result in local level exclusion. We had much stories about who is supposed to participate in CBC activities, who is not supposed to participate, and contestation around that has left people a bit indifferent about this whole idea. But also, really, as I think emerged also during the past presentation, it also hints to the deep-rooted nature of pastoralist vulnerability to climate change, that the past 20 years of community-based conservation as adaptation may not really be sufficient to uproot these ones without involving proper governance and political goodwill. And these findings do suggest the need for an understanding of climate change adaptation that acknowledge the role of power and politics in shaping adaptation outcomes. So those are really preliminary conclusions, and the work is still ongoing. And we hope that we can be able to confirm and build on these ones with time. Thank you very much. That's it from me.
Thank you very much for that, Jackson. Really fascinating work there. And we will hear more in the conversation also with our discussant. Now let's move very swiftly to the next and final presentation for today from Sylvia Jemutai Rotich. The title of the presentation is Maasai Pastoralist Adaptations Across Varying Land Tenure Systems in Kajiado County. Sylvia is a PhD student at the University of Nairobi and the University of Copenhagen. Sylvia, please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eka. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, and I can see your presentation as well.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm presenting on Maasai pastoralist adaptation across land tenure systems in Kajiado. From the first two photos in my slide shows us how land is communally used. So where land is grazed in a communal context, and then on the right, the far right, shows how pastoralists take their livestock to drink water in a communal context. And then on the two photos down shows the private land tenure where grazing is done in a private land. And also the pastoralists have the liberty to decide on what to use their land for. For instance, you can see crops. And so when we talk about a little the background of this study, a lot of droughts have been affecting pastoralists. And the photo we see in this presentation is one that I borrowed from the internet, and it shows that pastoralists are suffering from the droughts. And in the past years of 1960s and 1970s, the recurrence of drought were not severe as we currently experience. And the situation in East Africa, and especially for Kenya, is projected to worsen by 2050, according to the IPCC report. And pastoralism being a livelihood that's highly dependent on weather-related parameters such as rainfall, is one of the endangered economic sector. And historically, pastoralists were known to protect their livestock through mobility, where they could move from one place to another in search of pasture. But given the changing land tenure systems, especially among the pastoral communities, there is decrease in land, and therefore the previously available adaptation strategies are no longer applicable. And so in this context for Kajiado, for instance, we have the Group Ranch Act that was established in 1968 that's meant to subdivide the community land into group ranches. And so to this, it meant that the pastoralists were going to be restricted within the designated group ranches. And therefore, whenever there are droughts, this could imply that they were going to move within the group ranches. And so the argument of this study is based on the fact that changing land tenure has led to a paradigm shift in resource ownership and access. And therefore, whenever access to resources is affected, the adaptation strategies is also going to shift. And in the context of private land tenure, it has also led to exclusion and restricted access to resources, whereby in the previous places where pastoralists could go and graze their livestock is now narrowed to the private setting. And so the argument here is pastoralist adaptation choices are heterogeneous and dynamic. So even when we talk of the pastoralists in Kajiado, we have the varying tenure systems might lead to varying choices. And therefore, the recurrence of drought also can shape the trajectories that the pastoralists are undertaking. They might not use the same strategy, one drought after the other. And so this study is based on the research question that were purposely to interrogate how Maasai pastoral adaptation strategies have changed over time. We chose 30 years given the climate aspect, and then now to see how this has also changed in regard to land tenure systems. And so I came up with this conceptual framework just to see the relationship of varying aspects. So in this context, I'm considering the changing land tenure and the drought, the recurrence of droughts, and so affecting pastoralism as a livelihood in the context of an individual and at household level or at the community level. So when these pastoralists are affected, they come up with the adaptation strategies. This is what we borrowed from Ecological adaptation. And so for them to undertake any given adaptation strategy, they need access to resources. And in this context, we are referring to land, We also have water and social networks and relationships that can enable them access resources, especially in places beyond their jurisdiction, that is now the group ranch. And so for them to access these resources, they need institutions that could regulate access to these resources. For instance, in the group ranch level, we have the group ranch committee. So they don't just go and graze elsewhere. They have to be within the rules and the regulations. And so for my methodology, this study is based in Kajiado, the two group ranches, the two ranches. We have one that is communally owned, that is the reclamation. And then we have the Oldonyoro that is subdivided, and each person has their own parcel of land which is titled. So Kajiado is in the southern part of Kenya and neighboring Tanzania. And so for data collection methods, it was a mixed method approach where we had the household survey, randomly sampled households. So the numbers, we have the numbers of each method that we use, as you can see from this table. And so we also use the focus group discussions that were gendered and gendered in a gender perspective, and we had key informant interviews and the personal histories. Now that we were dealing with a period of 30 years, so the personal histories were helpful in getting the information on how this, the changing land tenure and the droughts had shaped the trajectories or the adaptation choices that people undertook over a long period of time. And so the diagram, the figure here shows the various adaptation strategies that were used before 2000, between 2000 and 2020, and the recently used adaptation strategies. The recently used ones refers to those adaptations that were used between the 2018 and the recent drought of 2021. So if I'm going to focus on, for instance, when we focus on mobility, in the before 2000, we see that mobility and communal pooling, for instance, were highly used in the past years. And so this was highly contributed by the fact that the resources then were communally shared, and there was strong social cohesion among the Maasais. Even when in places where the ranches were subdivided, there were no physical barriers that could hinder people from accessing these resources during droughts. And so the communal aspect was still strong. And when we go to marketing, for instance, we see low marketing of livestock before 2000, and we see the increase in the recently, as one of the recently used adaptation. So one of the contributing factors that we found in this study was that there is changing perception among the pastoralists in that they don't just wait for their livestock to die. So they decide to sell and through destocking, and then they restock during the rainy seasons. And so on the right, on my left, or when from your screen, so these are some of the adaptations that we captured. So the first photo shows the marketing of livestock. This is a market area called Bisil. It's an international livestock market between the Kenya and Tanzania pastoralists. And on the second photo, we see hay. So in the context of storage as an adaptation strategy, we see the pastoralists are now going into more of storage of fodder, because for instance, when we do subdivision, for those who have undertaken subdivision of land, they can fence off their pieces of land and harvest the hay for use during the drought. And the map that shows the Kenyan map here, the mapped, the years that we've marked here shows the movement of pastoralists from 2004 to 2018. So this shows the mobility of pastoralists between Kenya and Tanzania. So we found that the Kenya and Tanzanian Maasais have a strong social network, especially during droughts. And so for on Cremation, where the land is communally used, they have zoned their land in such a way that some areas are used during the wet season and some areas are also used during the dry season. And they have the subdivided zone, which is called Nguruman. Among the Maasai, Nguruman means cultivation. So the cultivated area is where it's subdivided and each person have their individual parcel of land. And so the model here shows it's a circular, kind of circular, where during the wet seasons, they graze their livestock at Oldorko. And then when the grass is depleted, they can move to cultivation area for those who have cultivated pieces of land. And after that, they can go to conservation area. And for the conservation area, it's managed by the Group Ranch Grazing Committee and the Conservation Committee. So there are specific rules when to take the livestock to graze at the conservation area. For instance, during our interviews, they mentioned that it's only used from the 1st of September. So grazing, you can graze your livestock elsewhere before September. So some people can opt to go to the cultivation zone, or some can even use hay or the stored pasture before taking their livestock to conservation area. And then when they are at the conservation area and there are rains, they can go back to the grazing, to the wet season grazing zone, or some can go to the escarpment. And so after the escarpment, they can go back to the grazing zone. And so to conclude, the conclusion remarks here are that adaptation choices depend on land tenure. We have varying tenure, varying adaptation strategies for private tenure and varying adaptations for communal tenure. For instance, the predominating adaptation strategies in the communal tenure were communal pooling and the mobility of livestock, where livestock were moved in different zones during different seasons. And also adaptation requires assets, and land is the key asset for adaptation purposes. And so for policy implications on adaptation policies must address land access or land governance, and it is based on people's own adaptation strategies. So in cases where we have people practicing mobility, for instance, the policy should align to the practices on the ground. Thank you so much for your time. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much for that, Sylvia. Really fascinating work. I look forward to the conversations that will follow. Colleagues, I'll just encourage you again, please put your questions in the Q&A tab there so that we can come to them when we finish. And we have our last speaker for the day. If I can invite Dr. Wanjiru Gichohi to join us. Dr. Wanjiru Gichohi is a research fellow at the African Leadership Center. Great to have you here. And I'll hand over to you now, Wanjiru, please.
Thank you very much, Eka, and good evening, everyone. Thank you as well to the presenters, Jackson and Sylvia Rotich, for the very interesting presentations that you've made. And I think I'll speak to Jackson's first, isn't it, Eka? And then we'll proceed later to Sylvia's. So thank you, Jackson. As I said, this is a very interesting and timely conversation. I'm very glad to see, what you're investigating in terms of all this, the issue of power politics in that space. Another thing that I loved about your presentation, and I think it cuts across the board for everyone, is the robustness of the methodology. There's a lot of data sources that you're using that speaks to the issue of triangulation, and it's quite interesting. I think just a few questions really for you, Jackson. First, you mentioned how this approaches that they're using that they're using at the community level sort of sync or link with the national policy context, deriving, of course, from Vision 2030. My question is, have you ever seen any contentions, between the state-led approaches and what is there at the community level? That is my first question. My second question was on the issue of ambivalence, and I think you touched on that at the conclusion, because I saw that you had reported that some of the respondents were neutral, and it was presented also in your paper. So how do you interpret that ambivalence? And I think you derived some insights from the qualitative data, so maybe you can add on to that if you so wish. Another question for you is, how do we distinguish between this act of adaptation and the informal rules and institutions that structure the ways in which technical expertise coming from the NGOs that you talked about, technical expertise is transformed into adaptation? I don't know whether I should repeat that. How do we distinguish between the act of adaptation itself and the informal rules and institutions that structure the ways in which technical expertise is transformed into adaptation? Sorry, I had noted this down, so I'm reading just from my diary. And lastly, I think my other question was on the politics, because you talked about the role of power in politics. So how does politics underpin the traditional notions of scale that sort of now come to frame these conversations around adaptation? How do you understand politics, and how does it underpin the traditional notions of scale that often frame adaptation? So those are my three questions for you, Jackson. Maybe you can touch on those, and then I'll leave the rest of the members to ask their questions. Thank you.
I go, Eka?
Yes, please. Yes, please, Jackson. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thanks very much. Thanks a lot, Dr. Wanjiru. Quite some tough questions there, and good reflection points. So I'll try to reflect my experiences and not necessarily answer all of them, and I think we can keep the discussion. And I will start bottom, moving to the top. The question of politics and how I understand politics, and or how that comes out in the paper, and how that affects adaptation, and how I distinguish adaptation from the informal rules and regulations and innovations that people have employed over years. And I would start by saying that I come from a school of thought that understands politics as day-to-day experiences and power plays that determines who gets what and doesn't get what. Okay, so it's really a multi-layered and has a high level of interaction, bringing together the local, the formal, the informal, and different levels. So it blends, and therefore, the whole idea and the notion around the fluidity of it, and therefore it forms part and parcel of adaptation. Because now, when you come to the adaptation, of course, as defined by the IPCC, rather, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's an adjustment in response to climate change, but there is also so much change that's happening at all these levels, be it socioeconomic, be it political, and that bends with the changes and that are happening around climate change in these areas. So climate change adaptation also incorporates those changes that are happening concurrent with climate change adaptation. And therefore, a lot of what happens and includes minute and sometimes simple innovations that people take to respond to climate change alongside other changes that are, accompanying climate change, those really constitute climate change adaptation. So I come to one of the main findings that comes from statistical analysis of the household data from 352 households that shows that pastoralists are mainly neutral or, around most of the potential of community-based conservation to build their climate change adaptation. As I mentioned, this is really subject to my third phase of data collection after this household survey. But based on the qualitative data that I also have on table, there are two likely explanations. So the first one being the fact that the processes of implementation of community-based conservation as climate change adaptation pathways has resulted into enormous exclusion. So there's so much politics and contestation around who gains, who don't gain from community-based conservation as ecosystem-based adaptation that people are like, it's not our thing. So they are a bit indifferent about that. And of course, the second explanation could be the fact that the vulnerability of pastoral communities because of years of marginalization is just too significant to be impacted by 10 15 years of community-based conservation. And the question around state and community, yeah, I think there's always contention. The state like often to go by the script. This is the climate change action plan of 2018-2022. This is the interventions that we need to implement according to this plan. But as you rightly mentioned, there's a whole lot of day-to-day innovations that contribute to climate change adaptation by the pastoralists that don't necessarily sync with what is in policy documents and aspirations of the state. Thanks. There are really questions that I need to go back to and see if I can use them to build on the paper. Thanks, Dr.
Thank you very much for that, Jackson. Much appreciated. Wanjiru, if you wanted to give your comments to Sylvia as well, that would be great. Thanks.
Yes, please. Thank you, Eka, for that. Thank you, Jackson, for those responses. I can see you've been thinking, and I noted also from your work that it's a work in progress. So I also appreciate that, and I get that the presentation that you're making is coming from a much broader paper. So thank you for responding to that. If I may speak to Sylvia's presentation, as I mentioned also for Jackson, very good, very rich, very timely conversation. Also for me, a diversity in terms of methods, and the focus on the pastoral community also struck me because in Kenya we focus a lot on the more visible land users like the farmers, the arable, and the others, and we do not look at this marginalized, quote unquote, pastoralist community. So thank you for highlighting that and the issues that they're going through. You have spoken a lot about the communal aspect of land and the issue of social networks. I had a question around that in terms of what are these networks, in terms of what is the breadth of this network, how many people, what kinds of people. Rahma at least did a good job of looking at the heterogeneity of that pastoralist space. So are there any members? She talked about the women, the gender aspect. What is the breadth of that? What is the depth of that as well in terms of, are there skilled people, and that kind of thing. So what is the breadth and depth of the social networks in that space? The other thing that I was reflecting on when you were presenting is the evolution of the adaptation strategies. And just a question, have they been driven largely by our traditional or indigenous knowledges, or has much of the influence that has led to this sort of continuum in strategies been driven from the West? Yeah, Jackson was presenting on NGO-led conservation. So where are they getting this strategies? Where is this knowledge coming from? Is it internal? Is it from their lived experience, or is it largely being influenced by external partners, especially from the West? And lastly, on the question on adaptation, have there been any other factors? You talked about land tenure mainly, but have there been any other factors that have been, driving this change in adaptation strategies? I was thinking about credit because you mentioned something about markets, bargaining power. Are there any other factors that have been driving this shift? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Some very fascinating comments and very rich questions there from Wanjiru to Sylvia. Sylvia, please, over to you to respond to those as you will. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ri, for the questions and the comments. So the one on the social networks, so you've asked of the breadth and the depth of the social networks. So basically what the pastoralists are dealing with is they are intergroup ranch social networks, and they also have international social networks where they utilize the social networks between the Maasais in Kenya and the Maasais in Tanzania. For instance, during the interview, some of the key informants mentioned that at times there might be no rainfall in Kenya, or there might be no grass for their livestock, but their friends in Tanzania can have plenty where they can take their livestock. So utilizing that aspect of international social network and also clanism. So they also talked of being Maasai, regardless of your country, being a Kenyan or Tanzanian, can enable you to access pasture during droughts. And also for instance, in Olkramatian, we have the neighboring Shompole group ranch, which is also not subdivided. And so whenever they have some resources, for instance, the rivers in Olkramatian might have dried up, and their neighboring group ranch, which is Shompole, can have water. They can still take their livestock to that, utilizing the same social relations to access water, for instance, in that group ranch. And for the private, for the pastoralists from the privatized land tenure, they can as well talk to their friends from the communal group ranch to access these resources. And for the evaluation, for the second question on the evaluation of adaptation strategies, it's both, they use both indigenous knowledge. For instance, they use the knowledge on where to get pastures, and for move their livestock too. And some of this information is also derived from the West. For instance, those who've gone to school and they've gotten some information, they also share with the local people, the local members of the community. And you mentioned the third one was to get to the land tenure, if it's the only factor affecting this adaptation. And it's one of the factors that can influence the adaptation choices. For instance, when I mentioned of the marketing as an adaptation strategy, it's we have the pressure, for instance, from the urbanizing areas of Kitengela, of Kajiado, for instance, Kitengela, and also Nairobi being adjacent to Kajiado. So the demand for livestock products, for instance, meat, and also milk is high. So it can also be a way of these pastoralists selling their livestock. So in one way or another, they are also adapting. Yeah, so it's a matter of, it's a multi-layered approach. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for those responses, Sylvia. That's great and really, really insightful. I see a comment also here from Rama, noting that, in her work, they're finding tensions between communities who have subdivided their land seeking pasture, tensions between those communities and those who have retained communal tenure. So that's another point to contribute to this conversation. I did note, I see we're 5 minutes to the hour, and noted some, again, really great questions from Alexandra von Au. And here we have, to both presenters, to what extent have pastoralist communities been involved in the political discourse relating to adaptation? I think that's the question being asked. So can both of you sort of reflect on that? Alexandra had a second question, but she says that was addressed by Jackson's response. So that's the question we have for you both. Jackson, perhaps you want to start us off?
I think Eka and to Alexander, I think we understand, or we have to understand this question based on the prevalent understanding of pastoralism by much media coverage and policy orientation that still approach pastoralists as destructive because of migration, as intrusive because of needing to access traditional grazing areas through areas that has already been privatized or fenced off. So so this understanding then means that their engagement with state processes of legislation and policy making is pretty low and requires a lot of improvements. But that said, we must, like in Kenya, note that there has also been quite some tremendous efforts to bring pastoralists into not just adaptation planning, but also governance and general development planning through frameworks like the Sustainable Development of Northern Kenya, for instance. But generally, because of the domineering understanding of pastoralists as not supposed to be undertaking pastoralism. So their involvement start from that point of departure, and therefore it's certainly very lopsided towards pastoralism or pastoralist view that can promote a sedentarization of the pastoralist and such kind of related approaches that are anti-extensive mobility. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Jackson. Can we go over to you, Sylvia, please?
Yeah, thank you. So to echo what Jackson has already mentioned, I think the research that we've done is also going to bring these pastoralists on board, and from now the discussions that we are going to have with them, it's one way of also engaging them in a way that they will bring their issues to the debates, especially through their local leaders, the ward administrators, who are also involved. For instance, in the communal group ranch, they are highly involved in the debates that are ongoing within the group ranch level. So in a way or another, they might be the contributors to the debates.
Thank you very much for that, Sylvia. And you've brought us really to a tidy end of the session today. Really, really insightful presentations and very rich responses from our discussant there. I was very struck in Jackson's presentation, thinking of, when you spoke about these 4 epochs that you identified, how all of this is interacting with sort of wider movements, for instance, in global development policy. And I noted that later you spoke about how these changes, they don't exist in a world of their own. Of course, they're really interdependent on shifts in wider narratives. So that shift in knowledge and policy, how it impacts what we read as science, right? Again, that point of what is science and how does it interact with all these other ways, with all these other sets of conversations is really interdependent, isn't it? And Sylvia, really, really fascinated by how your work complicates how we think of this constituency. In fact, all of you, your work does that, the constituency of pastoralists, because of the way in which you center the resource base and how that really impinges on what kind of adaptation measures are undertaken. So I thank you very much, all of you, for those presentations. Huge, huge thanks to our discussants. very, very rich comments that you've offered and questions, a lot of food for thought there. Also to all those that have participated, all our participants, for coming and being present with us, of course, for listening. And then, of course, for those very rich comments and very rich questions you have also offered to us. I'm very pleased to say that Jackson and Sylvia, and indeed Rama and Molo, join our community. Jackson and Sylvia will be with us physically, Rama and Molo not physically, but they're certainly part of this community. And I really look forward to seeing what we can try and do together. I think David had mentioned before how some leadership concepts and analysis actually bring a different lens to the conversations you're having. So I look forward to seeing how we might develop that. With that, we're 1 minute past the hour. Huge thanks to all of you. I wish you a very pleasant evening and fantastic work that's going on. Very much look forward to seeing how this develops and to the outputs that follow this. Thank you very much and take care. Goodbye.